So I'll start off by introducing myself. My name is Kelly Bowden, and I am the Youth and Campus Outreach Officer here at Oxfam Canada. This webinar today, Understanding Land Grabs and How They Affect Women's Food Security, is set up as a part of our Campus Learning Series. So these webinars are designed and aired once a month to help Oxfam supporters gain a better understanding of the campaigns that we're working on and the resources that are available to interact with Oxfam campaigns through these sessions. So this session specifically today is looking at the concept of land grabs and particularly Oxfam's new campaign surrounding land grabs. So in October, at the beginning of October, actually last week on October 4th, Oxfam launched a new global campaign to end land grabs. And so on October 4th, how this campaign launched is there was a number of activities that took place at a global level, and we released a new report entitled Our Land, Our Lives. And the timely sort of beginning of this campaign is framed around the fact that this weekend is the World Bank annual meeting. And so we wanted to open this conversation and put this on the agenda of the World Bank as it's coming up this coming week. So over the course of the next hour, what we're going to do is explore the concept of land grabs and also look at the different dimensions of who the actors are and how the implications of that phenomenon is taking place around the world. So I'm going to introduce Lauren Ravon, who is our policy analyst here at Oxfam Canada, and she's going to be doing a lot of the talking throughout the next hour. We'll also be flipping in and out of this presentation and showing you different resources that are available on our website and other websites that are connected to our campaign issue. So, Lauren, over to you.
So hi everyone, I hope you can hear me well. I'm glad to be invited to this webinar. It's fun, though I wish you were all here in person so I could actually see who I'm talking to, but I see your name, so that's nice. So I guess to begin with, I wanted to start talking about the global land rush. So when we talk about land grabs and the land rush, and there are two different things that are closely interconnected. So this global land rush is something that we've seen over the past 10 years or so, over the past decade, and that has really accelerated since 2008. So it's an increasing commercial interest in land throughout the world, but in developing countries in particular. And so we saw this trend spike around the world food price crisis in 2008, and it's on an upward trend, so it's something that's set to continue. I will just change slides. So there's a number of reasons that are explaining this interest in land. I think the first one was rising food prices. So as food prices were rising, investors saw this as an opportunity to invest in food production, to export to rich country markets that had huge demand for food. So as an interesting investment opportunity. Also, as we see, the global economy is growing. By 2050, it will probably have tripled. So there's a lot of demand for resources in general, and resources are found on land. Another factor is the demand for biofuels. A lot of land in countries like Canada and the United States, but also in developing countries, is being converted from food crops to biofuel crops to produce fuel for our cars, and this is particularly being driven by demand for biofuel in Europe and in Asia. And then there's I spoke to the issue of natural resources, and then there's just the issue of speculation. A lot of investors are actually buying up, acquiring land in developing countries, just hoping that the land that is now cheap will gain in value and that they'll be able to sell it for a profit later on. So many different factors that are pushing this trend forward. Now, it's important to see that this is investment in land, so acquiring land that belongs to local communities or countries, acquiring it by foreign investors for commercial purposes. So this is not the investment that we're looking for to end poverty and food insecurity. This is, when I guess the development community for years has been asking for more investment in agriculture and better investment in agriculture. This is not what we had in mind. And clearly, all evidence shows over the past 10 years that while not every land acquisition is a land grab and has human rights violations attached to it, overall the trend is certainly not a solution to hunger and poverty, and it's not helping development objectives in the South. We're also seeing that land in developing countries is not being sold for its full value, so it's being sold on the cheap. Local communities are not benefiting from this, but often governments themselves are not benefiting. So they're opening their doors to investors, giving tax breaks, and it's really not all that beneficial. We also see that the weakest governments and the countries in which there's the weakest land protection rights are the countries in which there's the most interest from investors. Now, in terms of a land grab and a land deal is any acquisition of land in a country, and we focus here on developing countries. Now, a land grab is a land deal gone wrong, if you'd like. So it's a land deal that's been unfair, that's been violent, in which communities that live on the land haven't been consulted, haven't been given the information to make an informed decision, and when the land deal goes through, haven't been fairly compensated for their loss. And generally, land grabs do involve evictions, people lose their homes, their livelihoods, and there's often an increase in food security because people don't have the land that they used to rely on to provide food for themselves and their families anymore. So in the context of Oxfam's campaign, we're really focusing on land acquisitions that are more than 200 hectares. So this is large scales of land. This is larger than what most family farms in Canada would be. It's larger than most land holdings throughout the developing world. And as I said, the main points that define a land grab versus a land deal is that there's human rights violations, there's a lack of consultation, communities aren't given the opportunity to give their consent, and a big reason for that is that because they don't have the information that they need to make informed decisions. Now you can see this little slide. I like it, and we have quite a few of these on Oxfam's websites, which give some interesting facts on this global trend. And this is interesting. About 2/3 of land deals are happening in places with serious hunger problems. And when we know that the majority of investors plan to produce food to export out of the country, this is really worrisome. And I can give you an example from Mozambique. We see that over the past couple of years, only 7% of all land deals that happened in the country were to produce food for the domestic market. So that means that everything else, all of the rest of the land acquired, was for either non-food crops or to export out of the country. And this at a time when 1/3 of the country was suffering from hunger. So it gives you really a sense that this is not helping the situation. As I mentioned before, clearly investors are smart. They're going to countries where land rights are not protected, where it's easy to come in and make deals quickly. It's where governments don't have the capacity or the willingness to regulate and make sure that both their communities and the country as a whole are making the most of these investment opportunities.
So we're just going to take a quick look now at one of the resources that Oxfam was a part of supporting the development of, which is the International Land Coalition's Land Matrix. So what this resource does, and you should be able to see it just here on the website. The website is landportal.info. And what you can do is you can come in here and take a look at data about where large-scale land acquisitions are taking place across the world. So if you go to this Get the Picture link up here on the top right hand, what it does is it brings up a map of investor and target countries. So the blue shows countries that are investing, and the orange shows countries where investments are being made. So if we go, for example, over to Canada and take a click on it here, we can see the connection between where Canadian investments have been made overseas. And so you can go back and do this with any number of countries to get a sense of where these investments are happening and the scale at which they're happening. So you can also see by the size of some of these bubbles, as you click on them, the sort of quantity and who the major players are. As you roll your mouse over them, they sort of increase in relation to the size of investments that are being made. So that sort of gives you a sense of how you can get a better picture of where these investments are happening around the world and what the scale of them is. This is also a really great resource because you can go into specifics. So if you were to, for example, click on Canada and see where some of our investments are taking place, we go to Brazil, which is where the largest amount of Canadian investment is happening. And if you go to the table link, what it does is it actually brings up a listing of the investors, the investment country, the region, the sector, the crop, and the actual size of the purchases as well. So that can give you a really extensive sort of understanding if you want to know the specifics and details of where some of these purchases are taking place. And that links back to the conversation that Lauren was just saying about the majority of these deals taking place in the places that have the least provision to sort of ensure that they are not harming the communities in which they're happening.
And just following up on that, in terms of the land matrix, what's interesting is that it gives us a good overview of where land deals are happening. So this is not information on specific land grabs, but shows a trend. And overall, what we're seeing is that most of these land deals are for biofuel production again. Most of them are happening in Africa, where we know that hunger problems are the most severe. It also gives you a sense of which investors are interested in what and what is fueling this trend. And also, I mean, if you look at things like scale, in Africa, where the majority of land deals are happening, already in the past decade or so, about 5% of the continent has been purchased by investors that are quickly grabbing up land. So this is really troubling. I mean, 5% in 10 years. If we don't get this trend under control, what will it be 10 years from now? So all of this sounds as though investment is counterproductive or not worthwhile for development and for fighting poverty. And it's not the case. But what we see is that while not every single land deal is a land grab, most land deals do not benefit local communities in any way. And so what we're really looking for is better, positive, and responsible investment in agriculture in developing countries. And when we talk about agriculture, it's really smallholder agriculture. So investing in the very small farms, the 500 small farmers in developing countries that are actually feeding 2 billion people globally. And investing in small farmers makes most sense because, ironically, they're feeding a lot of people, but they're the ones that are most suffering from hunger around the world. And so there's many types of investment that are needed, but as I said, investing in food production for local markets and not exporting abroad, investing in agriculture in ways that creates decent jobs for men and women, so not exploitation on plantations as we've seen, but good, decent jobs. Also investments that help the poor keep and build up their asset base, so not selling away the land, but actually keeping it and strengthening it. And then there's fair trade business models that Oxfam has been supporting and advocating for years. So I would recommend that you take a look at a recent report that Oxfam published on responsible investment, private investment in agriculture. Some interesting information on the kind of private sector solutions that are out there that could be positive as a counterbalance to this land rush that we're seeing now. Just trying to move on. Maybe Kelly can help me. Oh, okay. So
we're going to take a quick look just for a second at the report that Oxfam released on the issue of investment. So just a couple of weeks ago, as Lauren mentioned, we released this discussion paper called Private Investment in Agriculture, Why It's Essential and What's Needed. So this outlines some of the specifics that Lauren was speaking to in terms of what are our beliefs and principles around what positive investment looks like in agriculture. So there's a bit of an outline on how those investments could look and could work in terms of building on that concept. We're just going to take a quick minute here and go and take a look at some of the questions that have been submitted. So a couple of questions that come up. Are you including long-term leases or limiting to purchases in terms of our definition of what large-scale land acquisitions is?
Yeah, so we're looking at anything from leases to purchase. So it's really any foreign investor that will have control over the land for a given period of time. And what's interesting in some of the research that we've done here in Canada is that the majority of Canadian investments in land are actually leases not purchases.
And so in terms of going a bit further in understanding how the actual process of the investment and purchase works, another question we received is understanding who the actors are that's involved. So is it the government that is selling land from underneath the communities? And if it is, how are they forced to do that? How does it actually work in terms of on the ground when a purchase happens and a community is evicted?
So oftentimes it is the government. Now when we speak to the government, it can be at many levels. It can be the national government, but it can also be local authorities that are speaking in the name of local communities and not always defending their best interests. So in terms of national governments, oftentimes these governments are being pushed by lenders, by actors like the World Bank to open up their doors to investments, but they don't have the regulations in place to make sure those investments are actually beneficial for them and for their people. And so it's not always a case of governments wanting to do the wrong thing for their people, but not having the structures, the safeguards in place to make sure that everything goes right. And also, we've often seen that at the local level, community leaders or people that claim to be spokespeople for communities are actually selling away the land without the consent of their people and their communities. And so this is often a problem and has been quite well documented in some of the case studies that we've released on specific land deals. So people being poorly represented by their local, regional, or national leaders.
And there's also the question of investment that's occurring at the domestic level. So purchases that are happening within countries and not across international borders. So is that included in Oxfam's sort of analysis and understanding of land acquisitions and land purchases?
Yeah. So that's a really interesting question. And in the land matrix, and I would have to check and I would invite you to do so, I think the only focus is on foreign investment in land. That being said, the majority of land deals are still by local actors in their own country. So that's happening. What we've seen and what we're focusing on is this trend of foreign investors coming in and purchasing land for the benefit of northern countries for the most part. And that's very troubling. Now, that's not to say that land rights don't need to be strengthened in countries to protect people from domestic investors that could be buying up land in ways that's detrimental to local communities. But our focus with this campaign is really international investors.
So now we're going to jump back into the presentation for a little bit, but please do continue to submit questions through the chat bar, and we'll try and pull them out at the most relevant times. So going back to the conversation about how land purchases and land deals are affecting communities globally, we're going to look at the issue of how are women particularly affected by land deals.
Okay, great. And just before getting into that, the report that Kelly just showed us on positive investment in agriculture has quite a bit of really interesting information on how investment can benefit women or not accordingly. So I would really encourage you to take a look at it. Now, in terms of how women are being affected by land deals, there's two bits to that story. The first is how women are being affected by the increasing commercialization of land in developing countries more broadly. So what's linked to this global land rush. So as we see when land becomes commercialized, when there's more large-scale farming, men usually take over the production. Men are the ones signing contracts with investors or are the ones that have the control over supply chain issues. And so women tend to get pushed out. And more and more we're seeing that when crops become commercialized, what have been traditionally women's crops become crops that are under male control. And so there's even things like some roots in Africa that are used, like cassava, that are used traditionally by women for local food consumption. Now that these crops are being looked into as potential for biofuel production, these are coming under the control of men in communities. So there's these indirect impacts on women that you might not imagine, but that are actually squeezing women out of the local economy. We also see that with the commercialization of land in general, there's these big plantation schemes that are happening. And this can have so many impacts on women. Women are usually employed seasonally with the worst conditions in terms of pay and employment security, but it also has impacts on women community members more generally. So with large agricultural plantations, water is generally being funneled towards those plantations and away from the centers where women used to have access to water, so making it even more complicated for women to walk farther and farther to access water. So this is linked to the whole trend of commercialization of land. Now, in the case of land deals and land grabs in particular, what we're seeing happen is that women are having a harder time negotiating because the truth of the matter is women don't have land titles to begin with for the most part. Now, this is the case for many communities, but women are particularly affected. So if they don't actually have the land title, it's much harder for them to have a say in the way the negotiations go forward. And regardless of land titling, women generally don't have a seat at the table when negotiations happen. And this is rooted in gender inequality at many levels, but it plays out in land deals in particular. We're also seeing that when land deals happen, and I spoke about violence and forced evictions and other human rights violations, women are particularly vulnerable to intimidation and violence. And there have been many reported cases that you could refer to on this. And so very much gender-specific violence happening in the case of land deals and land grabs. And we're seeing that in terms of food security, if this global land rush is not improving food security and in some cases worsening the situation, women are even more affected by this. Women already in times of shortage will be eating least and last, and so when land deals are taking away food crops from the hands of communities, the first impact is on women and girls. And I thought I would illustrate with a couple of examples of how a land deal can actually have indirect impact on women. So for example, we've recently been doing a study on land deals in Zambia, and we'll be releasing reports on this shortly. But what's interesting to see is that there's been land deals for the production of beef in Zambia. And what the new owners of this land have done has been to fence off the area for their cattle raising. And this area used to be used by women to collect wild fruits and mushrooms and other things for traditional medicine. Now, what we're hearing from the women is that they're saying now that the land is fenced off, we can't access this, and that those fruit and those mushrooms are actually just rotting on the land. No one else is using them, but they can't have access to it. So it's not only the land women live on, but it's the land they rely on for other purposes, medicine, food, etc. And also, another case that we've been looking into is in Tanzania, where there's been a land deal. A company has acquired forests, and interestingly enough, women used to rely on those forests to get charcoal for their local cooking. And now women are being told you can no longer have access to the charcoal that you were collecting on that land, but you can buy it from the company. So while the land hasn't been directly taken from under their feet, they no longer have resources that made their lives a little easier, and now it's the cost of accessing the charcoal is now beyond their reach, so it's going to be going to urban areas most likely. I can't remember what other slides we have. Oh yeah, so here's some examples of the work that Oxfam is doing in support of women who are fighting to strengthen their land rights in their country and also to resist land grabs and land deals that are threatening their livelihoods. And some of this information is available on Oxfam Canada's website, and also the Female Food Hero Initiative. I think Kelly will speak to it, but we have information on our website, but there's also throughout the Oxfam Confederation really interesting work being done on this that has originated from Tanzania and is ongoing.
So we'll take a quick look, as Lauren said, at some of the connection to these resources online again. So specifically, the Pastoral Women's Council is one of Oxfam's partners in Tanzania, and this is just a quick link to their webpage. It's pastoralwomenscouncil.org, and this is just a page about their women's rights and leadership programming. So this is a part of what Oxfam is supporting through our partnership with them, and just down here you can sort of see the element that's highlighting the work that they're doing on strengthening women's understanding of their land rights within their communities. And so that's a part of our capacity building initiatives to enable people to be able to claim and enforce their own rights. So that's one of our partners, and you can take a look on the Oxfam website. I'll just link over to it now. If you go into what we do, you can take a look at success stories, and what that does is it outlines some particular case studies of individuals who have been affected by our programming, or there's also in the Where We Work section links to all of our partners around the world. And the Female Food Heroes Initiative that Lauren was speaking about is, again, an Oxfam Canada initiative, and what we've done is we have asked people, both Canadians and part of our partners around the world, to submit stories of women who are taking a stand to create a better food system around the world. And so this is just a Flickr site where all of these stories and images have been captured. So you can see there's sort of an outline here about the individual and how they're connected to the organization or what the work is that they're doing. and then a photo. So if you scroll through, you can sort of see, here's one of the Canadian examples of women who's a farmer in the Ottawa area, and then another international example of one of Oxfam's partners or people that are working in partnership with Oxfam globally. So this is sort of a neat way to sort of click through and see different people that are part of our global food system and how some of these issues connect into the land issue. Not all of these stories are directly in relation to land grabs or land deals or land rights, but they are connected to the food system, and so again ties in that sort of element of strengthening food security and food stability and understanding the role that land plays in that. So if you are interested in that, you can take a look at it on the Flickr page, or also it's available on the Oxfam Canada website. If you're on the Oxfam Canada website and you go into the Grow section of our site, then there is a tab just at the top here, Female Food Heroes, and that allows you to take a look at all of the stories that have been submitted. So we'll just go back to the slide here, and I think there was a quick question that we're going to take. And so the question is, what leadership roles are women undertaking in the resistance to these land grabs or land deals? Do they play a role in civil society leadership? What's the context of the role that women are playing in this resistance movement?
So our experience and what we've seen on the ground is that women are generally at the forefront of most social movements and movements for social justice, and this is another case where women are really standing up and fighting back. And what's interesting is that women are bringing forward non-traditional and different responses and solutions. So women are not always saying, the best way to prevent land grabs and to keep our land is to title all the land and to make sure that there's individual ownership of land, but saying we need to strengthen community ownership of land, we need to strengthen our capacity to keep control over common areas that we rely on for livestock, that we rely on for gathering food, for gathering water. So I'd say a more holistic approach to land and how it's linked to the community well-being and also to livelihoods and the local economy. So a lot of the work that we're going to be doing over the next year is highlighting some of these proposals that women are putting forward that are not often on the table, but that are really innovative. And in terms of the work Oxfam does, and here especially at Oxfam Canada, we really focus on strengthening women's transformative leadership in civil society organizations. So making sure that women's organizations themselves and women's leadership in mixed organizations is strong so that the voices of women can be heard and that they're at the table when public policies are developed, when laws are changed, when deals are made. Okay, so this slide comes back a bit to what I was saying earlier and to one of our questions about who's involved in the global land rush, who is actually acquiring land. We talked about the issue of domestic investors. Now we see there's really a range of investors that are involved. This goes from foreign governments. For example, we know that countries like Saudi Arabia that have little arable land are buying up land in developing countries to produce food to import back home. It can be transnational companies, but it also can be investors that you wouldn't necessarily think of. So it can be banks, pension funds, insurance companies, hedge funds, private equity firms. So basically investors that are looking for the best way to make a profit, and land is seen as the way to go these days. And then local investors. Now this slide mentions that Canadian investors are also looking into this trend. And what we've seen and what you'll see on the land matrix database is that Canada is not the primary driver behind this global trend of investing in land, but is definitely involved and is involved in ways that definitely follow global trends. So a focus on Africa, a focus on production for biofuels, a focus on production for exports. And we see that there are both Canadian companies that are purchasing land abroad, but there are also Canadian pension plans at different provincial levels that are either already investing in pooled land funds or are considering doing so in the future. And this goes to many levels. We know that banks are interested. We even know that university investors have considered this as a possible investment for the future. So we really see this as a rising trend and something that we want to draw attention to quickly to make sure that Canadian investors are not contributing to a trend that is highly problematic for hunger and poverty in developing countries. Now, that's the big picture. In the context of the campaign that Oxfam launched last week, we've decided to zoom in on one investor in particular, and one actor in particular, I should say, and it's the World Bank. And this might sound surprising because I think many people would not assume that the World Bank would have a huge role to play in this trend, but it definitely does. And we've decided to focus on the World Bank rather than, let's say, on a specific company or a bank or an investor, because the World Bank is involved in land deals in multiple ways. There's multiple roles. So the World Bank is a major investor in land. The World Bank as such is the biggest lender to developing countries. And we've seen that its investments in the agricultural sector have tripled over the last decade. So they're going from 2.5 to about $6 billion. So there's a lot of money to be invested, and increasingly that money is being invested in land acquisitions. Now, secondly, the World Bank plays the role of a policy advisor to developing countries. And what we've seen in recent years is that in terms of land, this policy advice is not always all that great. So the bank is advising countries on how to open up their doors to attract investors, and often helping countries speed up the process, encouraging countries to offer tax breaks, tax incentives to companies. So not always making sure that countries get the best possible deal when negotiating with foreign investors. In terms of policy advice, the World Bank is also the single largest donor to land policy reforms in developing countries. And this is a lot of money that's being pumped into this land reform advice. So, for example, $1.5 billion were invested in 2010 for this. So if they're going to be investing this much money, they have the potential to be giving good advice and helping strengthen local land rights and promote better land governance systems. And then thirdly, the World Bank is also a standard setter for other investors. So we know that the World Bank has a private sector lending arm. It's called International Finance Corporation. And through this lending arm, the World Bank sets standards that investors and those that they invest in have to follow. And once the World Bank sets standards, other investors are encouraged to follow those standards and to live up to them to be able to attract other investors. So there's really a very influential role to play in terms of the standards that the World Bank already has, but in the future improving those standards so that other investors can follow suit. Now what we've seen is that the World Bank actually doesn't disagree with Oxfam and with the work that many others are doing on this global land rush. So that they recognize that there's a problem, that there are land grabs that are happening, that this trend can be problematic, and yet they're not doing much to prevent land grabs and to turn the tide on this trend. And so we've seen, for example, in terms of transparency, the World Bank doesn't have very strict disclosure clauses for the intermediaries through which it invests. Also, as an example, we've seen over the past 2 years that the World Bank Ombudsman's caseload has tripled. So there's clearly a problem that's happening. The World Bank is seeing it because it's receiving those cases, and yet it's not reacting in terms of changing its policies and its practices. And then we also see that often the World Bank has good standards, but they're not well applied. And this is really what's leading to complaints. And so in Oxfam's report that I think Kelly will show you in a couple of minutes, we mentioned that there's been 21 community complaints regarding World Bank land-related projects since 2008. And this is really the tip of the iceberg, because for the community to be able to file a complaint with the World Bank, it's a huge step to take, and it's a lot of work, and not all communities are able to. But just the fact that there are these 21 complaints shows that something in the system isn't working. Either the standards aren't high enough or that they're not being properly applied. And after we have some time, I can mention some of these cases to give you an example of how these complaints have arisen, but also what steps the World Bank took based on these complaints. And what's interesting about these cases, it shows that communities are able to raise their voices, and that the World Bank, when it wants to, can actually make a difference by instating moratoria or taking direct action to ensure that violations are stopped and that reparations are given to local communities.
So we're just going to take a second here to jump out and to go and look at the report that Lauren was referring to. So back on the Oxfam Canada website, what we have here is a copy of Our Land, Our Lives, which is the technical briefing that we released last week to launch the campaign, and it's entitled Time Out on the Global Land Rush. And so what this report does is it sort of gives an overview, like Lauren was saying, of the different elements of the global trend of land acquisitions and the implications of those acquisitions around the world, and speaks specifically to the issue of land grabs, and then goes into more detail about the World Bank as an actor and the role that it plays in terms of policy setting and also standard setting, and how it plays a role not only on the ground in these communities and the cases that are linked to that, but also as a trendsetter in terms of the global investment community. So the easiest way to find that is if you go onto the Oxfam Canada website and you go into publications, and then it is the very first publication at the top there. You just click on it, and it brings up a little briefing that you can share with your friends. You can just click on the share at the bottom, and that will send the briefing note on to somebody else. And then if you click the link here, then you can download and print out the entire briefing. So it's available there.
Okay, so I see the time is going really quickly, so I won't get into too much detail, but as you might have all seen, the main focus of the campaign that we launched last week is focused on the World Bank and asking the World Bank for a 6-month freeze on all its land-related investments. So this is really the key part of our campaign. And the reason that we focused on this 6-month freeze is that it's to say, by freezing lending during a 6-month period, the World Bank will have time to examine its existing land-related portfolio, so to look into what's already happening, investigate cases where there have been community complaints, and then ensure that its policies, safeguards are in place to ensure and improved, if they're not in place, to ensure that problems won't occur in the future. So it's really to give a 6-month moment in time to step back and reconsider what's happening and take measures to prevent problems in the future. Now, in terms of the detailed asks to the World Bank, we're really focusing on transparency. So as I said, not all land deals that the World Bank finances have publicly available information, and so that makes it very difficult for local communities to actually decide whether or not they want these investments to go forward, when oftentimes they only find out about the investment once the bulldozer arrives in the community. Then we want to make sure that the World Bank is respecting and upholding what's known as the right to prior informed consent, so that communities have the information needed to make an informed decision about whether or not a land investment should happen. We want the World Bank to put into place better policies and be giving better advice in terms of land rights and good land governance at the national level. And finally, we want to make sure that all World Bank investments in land, but in general, are promoting local food security and not deteriorating. Now, as I mentioned, and I won't go into the details of this, but we've seen in the past that the World Bank has put a freeze on certain of its investments. For example, in the palm oil sector, the World Bank instated an 18-month freeze on all investments after seeing a huge amount of community complaints in Indonesia in particular. We've also seen that countries have instated freezes in land investments to give themselves the time to better regulate and set up domestic safeguards. So we've seen this in Mozambique, we've seen this in Cambodia, and another example. So yes, it has been done, and yes, it can work. So this is not a far out recommendation. It can be done, and it can help.
So in terms of moving forward and taking a step back and saying, we recognize the challenges of the issues that we've just been discussing. We know that the possible implications of large-scale land acquisitions can be negative and can be violations of communities' human rights. How, as Canadian citizens or people living in the global north, can we play a role in influencing and being a part of this conversation to help enable individuals and communities to better maintain and assert their own rights to their land and to the access to the resources that are inherently a part of that land. So what we're going to do quickly here is just go through some of the projects and programs and the way that OXFAM is sort of tackling this issue at the Canadian level. I'll speak a little bit briefly about what's happened to date in the past week and where we're at with the ongoing action that's been happening since October 4th, and then give you a sense of what are some of the things left that still need to be done. So if there are other questions in relation to the issue of land grabs and land acquisitions and some of the content and statistics that Lauren was talking about, please feel free to put them in the chat bar. I'm going to run through this and show you a couple of things on our website, and then we'll try and take some final questions before we head off. So this is a photo from last week, October 4th, the launch date of the land grab campaign in London. And so this was part of a number of stunts that happened around the world to highlight land grabs as an issue that we need to be concerned about as citizens in the North, and that we have a role in taking action to stop and to change. And so particularly how we're dealing with this at the Canadian level is that we are sending letters to Finance Minister Flaherty as he is attending the World Bank meeting this weekend. In the next coming days, they've probably headed there, they're already there now. So we're sending letters to try and encourage him to take a stand and to use his position as the Canadian governor at the World Bank to suggest and to urge the World Bank to take this freeze on, so to freeze that level of investment in land for the next 6 months. And so this is one way that we're directly speaking to our target and asking them to take our proposal into consideration is by sending these letters. So if you want to send a letter to the minister, the easiest way to do it, again, is to go onto the Oxfam Canada website, so actions.oxfam.ca. So if you are at the Oxfam Canada website, you can click on this big Stop Land Grabs image on our front page, and this will bring you to the Action Center on our land grabs campaign. And just here on the right-hand side, there's a link, Send a Letter to Minister Flaherty. And so you just click on that link, and it takes you down and gives you all of the fields to fill out. So you fill this out, and what it will do is it will produce an email that will be sent directly to Finance Minister Jim Flaherty, and he'll receive it in his inbox. Hopefully his inbox will be full of requests from Canadians while he's there at the World Bank meetings this weekend. We've already had over 700 people send letters to him, and so we're hoping to try and hit the 1,000 mark by the end of the weekend while he's still at the World Bank meetings. So please do go on, send a letter. You can read the letter below. This is exactly what will go out to him in his inbox, and then you can share it with your friends or your family or your networks to try and encourage them to speak up and encourage Mr. Flaherty in the same way. Other things that are going on is that Oxfam is organizing actions and stunts next week during Grow Week to raise awareness about land grabs. So as you saw in that previous photo, we are encouraging people to, in their own communities, take action in a similar sort of way and create symbolic land grabs so that this will help raise awareness of the issue, to bring attention to it at a community level and to get an understanding of what it is that is happening around the world. And so on oxfam.ca/grow/Grow Week, this is where you can download all of the tools and resources that are available in terms of setting up these stunts next week. So it's broken down into 5 minutes, 20 minutes, and more time. And so what this does is presents you with a couple of options as to what you can do in this amount of time. So you can sign the letter to Jim Flaherty. There's a specific project that we are collecting donations for in relation to Grow Week and to the Land Grabs campaign. And then it outlines some of the stuff that you can help us to push out on social media. So at the bottom of each of these pages, it's the toolkit, and there's a series of resources that are available for you to help plan actions and activities in your community. So there's key messages, there's a question and answer, which again, these are all downloadable resources, so it goes over some of the issues that we were talking about today. But I think the most key piece is the Land Grabs Action Guide. And so this outlines step by step how could you create or recreate one of these symbolic land grabs in your community to help draw attention to this issue. If you are a campus group, all of these resources are available. If you go on oxfam.ca, up here in the top right-hand corner, go to campus groups and you go to the National Action tab, and this again has all of the resources in a downloadable fashion. So we're asking all of the campus groups to register the actions that you're taking. So all of the actions that are being planned for October 17th, if you can please sign them up and put the information in online here, and that way Oxfam will have a sense of knowing where and when all of the different activities across the country are taking place. So last but not least, we're also trying to create a buzz on social media about land grabs and about the issues surrounding land grabs. So if you are on Facebook or Twitter, you can follow Oxfam Canada, and that will give you an idea of what some of the content it is that we're talking about in relation to this issue. So if you go onto our webpage here, our Facebook page, you can see that we've been trying to promote and share information about the Land Grabs campaign. So putting out some of those infographics and also sharing stories of some of our female food heroes that are involved in land issues, and drawing attention to sort of the conversations that are happening with the World Bank online. This is one of the social media campaigns that was running last week, is that we were getting people to participate in the World Bank's hashtag conversation, what will it take to end hunger? And we were getting people to share comments with that hashtag around the issue of land rights and land awareness. So that sort of brings us to a close in terms of the ways that you can get connected to Oxfam Canada on these issues. OxfamCanada.ca/grow is our Grow campaign website, and that's where you can find more information about our land campaign, but also any of the other issues that we are talking about in relation to Grow. So we're going to take a couple of minutes to go back and just do a couple of final questions here. So I'm going to read the questions out, and we'll have Lauren sort of take some time to respond to them. So the first question is actually sort of flipping back to the conversation about women playing a primary role as resistors and advocates for land rights, resistors to land grabs and advocates for land rights. So one of the questions was, do we, Oxfam, involve men in the social justice movement, and what is the response from communities about the involvement of men?
So the answer is yes. We work with both men and women, and throughout the Oxfam Confederation, we have many different approaches to working with civil society groups. Some of the Oxfams, like Oxfam Canada, focus more on working with women's movements and women's groups and promoting women's leaderships, but there's some Oxfam affiliates that focus on involving indigenous communities and marginalized urban communities. So we have many different approaches to working with civil society. And I should say that as Oxfam Canada, we have a commitment institutionally to ensuring that 50% of all of our programming funds go to supporting women's leadership, and that all of our funds, so 100% of our programming funds, go to organizations that are committed to gender justice. And so this means working with both men and women in those organizations.
So our next series of questions is around the idea of the freeze on investment from the World Bank, and sort of putting some questions forward about the difference between policy and practice. So I'll just read the question out here. It says, my main concern is policy versus reality. For example, you mentioned that Cambodia has placed a freeze on land investments. In reality, this is a tactic of the Cambodian government, so to look as though they are taking a responsible role. In reality, domestic investors are partnering with transnational corporations and continue their exploitation of land in Cambodia. How do we put policy into practice? And so again, this is sort of summarized in saying a 6-month freeze on World Bank supported deals, is this likely to have an effect?
So we've been working on the issue of land deals and land grabs for a number of years, and over the past we've tried different tactics. So we've tried looking at specific cases of land investments by individual companies or funders or banks, and really putting pressures on those individual companies. And we've seen that it's important to highlight bad practices and to put pressure in those cases, but the impact of that is relatively small. Obviously, important impacts for local communities, but on the big picture, it's relatively small. So this is the main reason why we wanted to focus on a big global actor like the World Bank. And I think in the comment it's mentioned that the World Bank's portion of investments is fairly small. It may not be the biggest investor, but it is one investor that definitely sets trends, sends signals to other investors. And so, yes, you could focus on one bank, you could focus on one pension plan, but by getting the World Bank to review its policies and to send a strong signal that safeguards need to be strengthened and better rules be put in place, we think that that has a huge chance to have an impact, more than only going after individual actors. Now, that's not to be said that that can't be done in tandem. The other issue is the policy dimension of the World Bank's advice to developing countries. Now, a big part of the problem is that developing countries are either opening up their doors to investors in a way that is unregulated, or that they don't have strong land governance to begin with. And so what we're pushing for is for the World Bank to be providing better advice and better programs to strengthen land governance, and also pushing developing countries themselves to institute better rules to protect land tenure of local communities. Now, let me see the question. I mean, the gap between policy and practice is real, and this is why in the report that we released last week, we showed how the World Bank does have policies and safeguards in place, and yet community complaints are continually coming to the fore, and the World Bank needs to take these seriously. So there's obviously a gap. But in some cases, the policies aren't even good, and the advice that's being given isn't even good. So it's definitely a place to start, and this has to be done in tandem with strengthening local communities, local governance. I mean, that can go from the municipal level to the national level, to make sure that those that are responsible for land governance at the local level are able to protect the rights of communities. So it's work that has to happen on many fronts. It's at global policy level, it's at strengthening civil society and their capacity to raise their voice, empowering governments that are willing to strengthen legislation and governance around land. There's not one easy answer to this problem.
So we're going to take this opportunity to sort of wrap up this conversation. This webinar will be placed online, available for viewing post-session at www.oxfam.ca. And so if there are additional questions or comments that you have in relation to Oxfam's perspective on land investments, large-scale land acquisitions, and land grabs, please feel free to take a look at some of the resources on the oxfam.ca website, or to contact us by email, and we can answer those questions more directly in conversation afterwards. So thanks so much for being available today and for sharing this hour with us, and hopefully you all got a better understanding of the work that Oxfam is doing both at the global policy level in terms of exploring this issue, and also in terms of the on-the-ground campaigning work that's happening in Canada at the moment. So thanks so much all for being here today, and hopefully we will connect again soon in the future. Thanks. Bye-bye.